Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. It is the U.S. holiday of Thanksgiving. I see that the conversation got going pretty early on today. I approve of that. I will allow it. What a lovely day it is. Wow. Wow, folks. Shout out to everyone. I don't know what you did this holiday. I was able to have a nice dinner with my spouse and with a longtime friend at a relaxing restaurant in my Brooklyn neighborhood. Very peaceful, very enjoyable. I hope that you were able to do something that brought you some satisfaction. Don't know what that could be. Different things satisfy different people. Some people enjoy traveling long distances to see their families. Other people enjoy playing video games. Other people enjoy sleeping in, whatever it is that brings you satisfaction. I hope you were able to do that for your holiday. Shout out to Ramiro Funes, who says he's reading City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, and he can't put it down. Well, thank you, Ramiro. I'm glad you liked the new book. I put a lot of work into that lovely text, and you're not the only one. I mean, this book was a hit. I mean, people are reading it. The numbers I keep getting from the publishing company are, this is something special here. So if you haven't gotten your copy, be sure to get it. But folks, I realize that these holiday evening lives are actually kind of a good idea. I did one on July 4th. It went pretty well. And hey, I mean, most people don't watch these as they're happening. They watch them afterwards or whatnot. So if you're not watching it as it happens, that's okay. You'll catch it afterwards. You'll enjoy it. Folks, I gave a shout out to Ramiro, but I see Lincolnite Yankee. Why don't we actually do that thing we always do with you give your name and location so we all know who's from where and who's part of this conversation. Let's do that thing. I know Ramiro's out in Los Angeles. I don't know where Lincolnite Yankee is, but JT24 is in Mississippi. Varathius is in Los Angeles. Dan Uko is in Bayonne, New Jersey. Anthony Penza is in Cleveland, Ohio. Pirate Alex is in Cleveland also. Tanky is in New Zealand. Hamburg, Germany. Central Coast, Australia. East Germany. Lee County, Florida. Cleveland, Chris Samanchek. Eugene, Oregon. Missouri. Clark, New Jersey. St. Louis, Missouri. Alex Giovanni. Mr. Red is in Hello, California. Is in Hello from California. Someone said Transylvanian. Charlotte, North Carolina, says Lincolnite Yankee. Bellingham, Washington, says Desiree Pack. Arthur is out in Arizona. Donnie Wallace says hello. Boston. Shanghai, China. Wow. Great times we're having here. He says Pennsylvania, not Transylvania. Well, that's good. Transylvania's in Romania. So, would I welcome? I would happy. St. George, Utah. What's your path to journalism? Keep Japan. Someone from Japan is on. Not surprising. Folks, tweet this out. Make this a bigger conversation. I'm sure there are some people in the United States who are celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday, that it's now evening time. They're digesting a Thanksgiving meal, and they are ready to join our conversation. I see Austin, Texas. I see Donnie Wallace wants me to run for president. Well, I don't have any political aspirations at this time, but thank you, Donnie. I do appreciate the compliment of wanting me to be the future leader of the United States of America. A very kind thing for you to say. Oh, and someone says that they are in Timisoara, Romania. Very cool. Someone named George Vlad. That's neat. Cool. Hey, we have a global audience here. We have all kinds of people from all over the world who like what we do here. Folks, a couple things I wanted to start out with. I mean, this Democratic primary. Wow, folks. So Andrew Yang, I don't know if folks saw, the Democratic candidate, the billionaire who wants universal basic income, wants college athletes to get paid, and what else does he want? He wants to abolish the penny. He's got a lot of quirky ideas. People are reminded of technocracy. So Andrew Yang says that he is boycotting MSNBC, that they have treated him so badly, given him so much less time than other candidates, And folks, I will tell you that interview he did with Rachel Maddow, where she said to him, "What country has the U.S. ever meddled in? We've never. What country has the U.S. meddled in the elections? What, I mean, what does that happen?" And of course, we know Rachel Maddow used to be with Air America. She knows all about U.S. coups and CIA history. She's just playing dumb because that's what the owners of MSNBC and the advertisers and the apparatus there wants to hear. The folks who got rid of my old buddy. I wouldn't call him a buddy, but I met him and got along with him. Ed Schultz was somebody I had the honor of working with before he passed away. And I talked to him, and he certainly, his whole story about MSNBC and his departure from there and how they didn't want him to cover Bernie Sanders and all of that. Ed Schultz certainly had a lot of stories to tell about MSNBC. But folks, so Andrew Yang is boycotting MSNBC. That's one thing that's happened. Furthermore, we've got Tulsi Gabbard, who is the candidate who's made anti-war like the fixture of her candidacy. Now, there's some positions she has on some other things maybe people don't agree with. But regardless, she has made exposing the U.S. support for destabilization of Syria. She's made opposition to escalating the arms race with Russia. That's been a big central aspect of her campaign. So we have Saturday Night Live basically comparing her to Cruella de Vil on 101 Dalmatians, right? And they have her on there talking about the Dalmatian puppies, and that's beyond me, right? Tulsi Gabbard, she just doesn't come across like a Hollywood villain. They're just nasty. We've got Bernie Sanders, as he's speaking at the last Democratic debate, we see Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden smirking, like like laughing, like listen to this guy talk. This Democratic primary, and then we, of course, have got Bloomberg now in the race, the former mayor of this city. And if you see some of these clips of him talking, he just completely lacks any enthusiasm. Like, his heart is not in it. He doesn't want to be there. It's just he's not really excited about it. From what we understand, and shout out to Nathaniel Adams joining us, from what we understand, Barack Obama is probably playing a bigger role in this Democratic primary behind the scenes than we realize. Barack Obama apparently, according to the rumors, has put pressure on Bloomberg to run. He's saying anything but Bernie, doing anything to try and block Bernie Sanders from running. So Barack Obama, whose presidency just went so well, wasn't it? It was such an amazing presidency, right? It worked out so well. There's no racial strife in the United States ever again, right? He got in there, and the USA, it's a more perfect union, right? Oops, right? He got in there on the anti-war platform and expanded, the wars to all over the world. He got in there. He was going to, make the USA's relationship with Muslims better, and, look how that turned out. Barack Obama, it was the Barack Obama presidency was an epic disaster. But yet Barack Obama seems to be the one who can forget. JT24 brings up the NSA spying, and he's right about that, expanding the police state, running on a civil liberties, protect whistleblowers platform, and then expanding the police state. The Obama presidency was an epic disaster. But Barack Obama seems to be directing a lot of this from behind the scenes and urging Bloomberg to run and anything but Bernie. And this is something you can't underestimate it, really. This is getting to be weird. And I was talking with a friend of mine, and I've actually said this before. But before I make there's a historical analogy that I think is relevant, that certainly is on my mind. But before I get there, first of all, I want to mention Michael Moore. I remember Michael Moore, right? You know what I'm talking about. The filmmaker, Bowling for Columbine, Fahrenheit 9/11, Roger and Me. Michael Moore, I remember during the 2004 election, he played this role of kind of rallying the far left to vote for John Kerry. And Michael Moore, I mean, his movie Roger and Me was very pro-union. Bowling for Columbine's very critical of U.S. foreign policy and gun culture and such. And he's now apparently a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and he's always been kind of a social democrat. And his career at some points he's actually taken some hard socialist stances. I know when he was editor of The Nation magazine, he ended up getting pushed out because he refused to run articles that were critical of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, right? And he basically defended them. That was pretty cool. And he's said a lot of positive stuff about Cuba and highlighted their achievements and successes, which I think is pretty neat. But there's other things you can criticize him for. I know he actually wrote an entire article at one point blasting Monica Moorhead from the Workers' World Party by name, like calling her out. And it was sarcasm, and it was making fun of the people who blamed Ralph Nader for Al Gore's victory. And so he decided to write an entire piece highlighting Monica Moorhead of the Workers' World Party. That was pretty strange. And he's been all over the place. Michael Moore has just been all over the place. But if you look at him during this election, there's been some times where he's been repeating this Russiagate nonsense. Trump is a traitor, Russian agent, all this nonsense that, the Russians rigged our elections, Russia is fascist, Trump is fascist, it's all a big fascist. All this nonsense that has infected lefty circles, the Rachel Maddow hysterics, the McCarthyism, the new Cold War gibberish, the garbage, the kind of stuff you're hearing from these impeachment hearings, that kind of neocon Cold War nonsense. He's repeated a lot of that. I don't approve of that. However, he did something that I thought was amusing, and he said that the system is rigged recently. And again, what does he mean by that? But he said that, that a number of people have voted for Trump, not because they're racist, but because they understand that the system is rigged. Right? The system is rigged. And that the system is rigged, and they were right, and the economic system is rigged, the electoral system is rigged, right? He's saying this. Hey, good for him for saying that. Michael Moore has been all over the place. It seems like in the last few years, he's really cozied up to the DNC, and he's become kind of a talking head for the Democratic Party. He's just a Democratic Party voice, but he still kind of has a far left socialist, voice. So it's complicated. So then that gets me to the point that I wanted to make, which is my fear about what could be in the works for us in this upcoming Democratic primary. I want to make a historical analogy because, again, I'm not saying this is necessarily what's going to happen. Okay? I'm just going to point you towards something historical and something I fear could happen. So, folks, I don't know if you remember. I don't remember. I wasn't born yet. But if you look over history, the 1968 Democratic primary got ugly because there was a huge anti-war movement of people who didn't want to expand and continue the Vietnam War. In fact, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for president once again because he had mixed feelings about the Vietnam War. So a lot of rank-and-file Democrats had been supporting Robert Kennedy, who was against the Vietnam War. He was murdered, killed. So a lot of rank-and-file Democrats had been supporting a guy named Eugene McCarthy, who was kind of far-left, kind of a social democrat. But they ended up at the Democratic National Convention, and back then it wasn't exactly a primary. It was much more, party bosses make the decisions. They ended up nominating Hubert Humphrey. And Hubert Humphrey was somebody who was associated with the Civil Rights Movement, but he was also somebody who was very, very supportive of the Vietnam War. And it was very famous, 1968, riots in the streets outside the conventions, the police beating up protesters and people getting badly injured, and it was chaos in the streets of Chicago. The Chicago police viciously attacked these protesters and protests outside and demonstrations, and it was a disaster, and it was all on TV, and the young anti-war activists, most of them was students for a democratic society, were chanting, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." Everyone looked at the Democratic Party and said, oh boy, because a lot of Democrats didn't support the Vietnam War, but the Democrats nominated a pro-Vietnam War guy. And it was epic. It was a big moment in U.S. history, 1968. So after the 1968 convention, and of course, Richard Nixon won the election. The Republicans won the 1968 election. So the next national election that happens, when Nixon is running for re-election, 1972, the Democrats completely rewrote the rules of their party, right? And they changed the rules. They came up with the primaries and the delegates and the super delegates, and a lot of the rules that are in place now were written in the aftermath of the 1968 mess, right? Where, and that's, during when all these protesters are being beaten in the streets. There's a famous clip of Mayor Daley of Chicago, this big, Democratic Party boss, mayor of Chicago. And he says, you have to understand the confrontation wasn't created by the police. It was created by the people who charged the police. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman's there to preserve disorder, right? And it was, of course, a misspeech. He meant prevent disorder, but he said preserve disorder. And it was kind of like one of those classic misspeeches. But, it was a disaster. 1968 Democratic Convention, in the streets, protesters, anti-war people getting beaten up, and the whole world is watching, and it was a disaster. So the Democrats rewrote their rules after that. They rewrote their rules. And in 1972, the Democrats nominated Eugene McCarthy as their candidate. And they nominated him, but they didn't really support him. And that was the whole thing. The Democrats, they nominated Eugene McCarthy. They let Jerry Rubin, who was like a 60s radical, called himself an anarchist, Jerry Rubin, they let him speak at the 1972 Democratic Party convention. And they let the far left do their thing. It was 1972, coming out of the 60s, the hippie movement. And the Democrats said, all right, you do that. And the Democratic Convention of 1972, fine. They let the far left do it. And of course, the vice presidential candidate was this guy named Eagleton. It came out that Eagleton had been hospitalized for depression. He'd been in a mental hospital. It was George McGovern. I'm sorry, not Eugene McCarthy. George McGovern. Wow, epic slip up there. Thanks for catching that, Alex Giovanni. So they gave George McGovern the nomination. And it came out that this fellow Eagleton, who'd been the vice presidential nominee, had been hospitalized for depression. So they dropped him from the ticket. That was very embarrassing. They replaced the vice presidential candidate like halfway through the election. George McGovern was the nominee. Far left, vote for me, I will immediately end the Vietnam War, guaranteed employment, all kinds of very radical left kind of things. But the Democratic Party didn't really support him. The Democratic Party apparatus really said, okay, we're going to prove to the far left, we're going to prove to the dissident element, we're going to prove to the dissidents, to the far left, we're going to prove to them that it's not rigged. We're going to let them have their convention, let Jerry Rubin be a speaker, let George McGovern be the candidate, let them do their thing. We're not really going to support it. We're going to, okay, far left, see, it's not rigged against you. You guys won. And then George McGovern, of course, lost to Richard Nixon. And my fear, not even my fear, I shouldn't even say my fear. I'm almost wondering, it's not even really a fear, because at this point I don't have a horse in this game in like I don't know. I shouldn't say my fear, but I should say my wondering is this what the Democrats are going to do this time? Is it possible that they'll nominate Bernie Sanders? And they'll say, okay, it's not rigged. See, you thought it was rigged for it. No. It's not rigged. Bernie Sanders is the candidate. And then all those Democratic Party donors, all those figures in the Democratic Party who would prefer Bernie to Trump, well, not support the Bernie campaign. Just do it. And they'll say, oh, look, this is what happens when the socialists win, People just don't want it. You went too far left. And is it possible they could do that, right? We know that Bloomberg, who's just entered the race, was talking about backing Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz is the billionaire owner of Starbucks, big supporter of Israel, low-wage employer, just an awful fella. Howard Schultz said that if Bernie gets the nomination, he will run as a third-party candidate. And CNN has had him on to discuss how he's considering this. And Bloomberg said that he would support Howard Schultz as a third-party candidate running against Bernie if Bernie got the nomination. So, is it possible that the Democrats will say, you know what? All right, the far left, do your thing, pull all their support behind Schultz or Bloomberg, or just stay home, just, pull and not put any energy, just not really put the Democratic Party behind Bernie Sanders, and let Trump get reelected, and then walk back up to the table and say, well, that's what happens when you go too far left, Is that possible? Could we see 1972 all over again? Will the Democratic Party machine... Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, my goodness gracious, folks. I dropped a book. I dropped. Can you see me, folks? Are we all okay? We're all okay, right? Wow. Goodness gracious, I gotta get something better than that. But anyway, is it possible, folks, that this is what the Democrats are planning to do? Is it possible that the Democrats are planning to run a not serious campaign? Is it possible? Is it possible that they're planning to run to let Bernie win the nomination and then throw the election for Trump? Is that possible? Is it possible? I think it's very possible that they could do something like that. I think it's very, very possible that could be what's in the works. I don't know. The other thing, though, is that there was talk of Elizabeth Warren. They were trying to say for a while, and I thought that was the latest talking point from mainstream kind of Democrats. Their talking point was that Elizabeth Warren was just like Bernie Sanders. Elizabeth Warren was just like Bernie Sanders. Well, she's not. She's clearly not. Her record shows she's not just like Bernie Sanders. Really, she's not. I mean, that's like an untrue statement. But that was the memo that was going out on MSNBC. Well, hey, all these Bernie people should all vote for Elizabeth Warren because she's just like Bernie Sanders. The argument then became, well, you're sexist, right? If you support Elizabeth Warren, or if you support Bernie over Elizabeth Warren, because they're just the same. Well, they're not the same. They have similar rhetoric, right? Elizabeth Warren, she shouted that. We all remember, or at least I do, 2012, Elizabeth Warren spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Corporations are not people. They're not people. And that was supposed to be so epic. Oh my God, she disagreed with the Supreme Court ruling that, Citizens United. It was all crazy. It was all very, very crazy. And it makes me wonder if that's in the works. We shall see what's going to happen. The mainstream doesn't like Bernie Sanders, but even more than Bernie Sanders, they really don't like Tulsi Gabbard, and they really don't like Andrew Yang. They've made that abundantly clear. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, and I'm just going to throw this out there, okay? So, have you noticed? So all throughout the Obama presidency, the right wing had this argument against Obama. Why won't he use the phrase Islamic terrorism? Right? And that was a whole big talking point. Why won't he call it Islamic terror? Why can't he just say Islamic terror? Why won't he do it? Why won't he say Islamic terror? That was the argument. Why won't he say, Islamic terror? And that was this whole thing. And, Obama was not a supporter of ISIS, clearly. He was not a supporter of Al-Qaeda. I mean, what was the argument? He wouldn't call it Islamic terror. Well, we know that the United States, behind the scenes, was negotiating, was utilizing, Al-Qaeda-like groups in Libya and Syria. We know, there was trying to send a message to the Arab world that Obama was not friendly to Israel and was more sympathetic to them. He went and tried to reboot U.S. relations with the Muslim world. That was very, very famous. So, What was going on there? Why? What? I mean, and he, to be fair, he didn't use that phrase, Islamic terror. He just didn't use the word. And it was pretty clear that, like, he didn't use that word for a reason, right? That was something that they had agreed upon, right? When he gave that whole speech and said ISIS says that they're Muslims, but they're not. That was, I mean, it was like there was a constituency. The U.S. foreign policy was trying to work with. He can say bad things about different groups, but he can't say the phrase Islamic terror. It meant something. It served some kind of foreign policy, soft power negotiating edge. So fast forward to 2016, right? Many people, including myself, are very, very disappointed with Bernie Sanders and what he said about Venezuela. Right? I mean, he's, the things that he said, you can look it up about Hugo Chavez and others. But you'll notice that they have picked up on, at least MSNBC and others have picked up on and baited, Bernie has been baited about this in debates, that he will not call Maduro a dictator. Did folks see that? That he won't call Maduro a dictator. Right? And that he'll call him a tyrant. He'll say that he's repressive. He'll say all kinds of bad things about Venezuela, but he just won't use the word dictator. And that they're calling him out for this. But that makes me wonder, you see, the fact that they've picked up on the fact that he will not use the word dictator, they're baiting him on it, makes me wonder if actually behind the scenes there is more pro-Venezuelan sentiment within the Bernie campaign than you would realize. Because it's very odd, right? Just like Obama wouldn't use the word Islamic terror, that meant something, right? When presidential figures won't use certain words, when they won't use certain terminology, when they'll use other terminology that sounds like it, but they won't actually say, that terminology, that tends to mean something. Tends to mean something. I mean, that tends to mean something. So what does it mean? I don't know. And I feel like, Bernie, especially in 1999, he supported the bombing of Serbia. That was when a lot of the anti-war far left, began to have the most solid criticism of him. I know Michael Parenti says that's when he had his falling out with Bernie Sanders. But what I think is interesting is that they keep bringing up those videos of him in Nicaragua, in Cuba. And I feel like the foreign policy neocons, they don't trust him. It's not that they don't like his economic policy, but the CIA, whatever you want to call it, that wing of the U.S., government that focuses on foreign policy and regime change just doesn't trust Bernie Sanders. They don't trust him on foreign policy, and that they seem to sense that even though Bernie Sanders says a lot of things that those of us who are solidly anti-imperialist don't agree with, it may be possible that they seem to know that he doesn't exactly mean all of that. I don't know, okay? And I think it's interesting that they have picked up on the fact that he will not use the word dictator to describe Maduro, right? All the other nasty things he said about Maduro and Chavez, you would think that wouldn't matter, but it matters. And they seem to have picked up on the fact that there's something going on there. I think that's fascinating. I think it's very, very interesting. But what else is going on, folks? I see more people are joining us. Please tweet this out if you haven't already. Please bring people on to join the conversation. Yeah, folks, so North Korea apparently has had a rocket test. I don't know if people saw that. They tested another rocket because the USA seems to have backed away from the talks. Did you see that? I mean, the USA seems to not be willing to talk as it once was, and so they seem to have tested another rocket. I must tell you, I feel like these talks between Trump and North Korea were sabotaged in a lot of ways. I mean, we know about the attack on the North Korean embassy in Spain and how that went down. That was particularly awful. We know about the comment made by John Bolton, who's now out of the Trump administration, saying that a Libya scenario was what they were going for with North Korea. So there's many layers to this, I think, but it's amusing, and so North Korea's tested another rocket. They said, okay, fine, you don't want to negotiate with us, you don't want to talk about lifting the sanctions, you don't want to, all right, now Trump is the first U.S. head of state to ever visit North Korea. That's big, but the talks seem to be frozen, so North Korea's tested another missile. Are we surprised? Should we be surprised? No. Now, what's interesting is that South Korea, at this point, they want peace with North Korea. China obviously wants peace with North Korea. Russia obviously wants peace with North Korea. So everyone but the USA and the U.S. aligned countries seem to be on board with this. I think most of Europe probably wants to negotiate with North Korea. I think this is a U.S. and Britain thing. This is an apparatus. This is the Rhodes Round Table. This is the Eastern establishment that doesn't want this. And basically everyone else seems to be standing up to them. And this is a straight-up contradiction between the Rhodes Round Table, the Eastern establishment, and everyone else. Because it seems like other than this neocon U.S. foreign policy circle, everyone likes the idea of North Korea giving up their nuclear weapons and joining the global economy and having their Deng Xiaoping moment. Everyone's kind of ready for that, right? We know what's going on in Russia's Far East, and we know what's going on with One Belt, One Road initiative, with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. And South Korea is really excited, and they got trains connecting it, but there's nothing on those trains because of the sanctions. And everyone's kind of waiting for North Korea to join the global economy. It's going to happen. And the United States seemed to be kind of on board, and then they backed away. So I'm wondering what's going to happen next. Now, is this just a negotiating tactic? Is the USA walking away? North Korea's walking away, and this will start up again pretty soon? We don't know. When Trump went to North Korea, that was a huge surprise. No one saw that coming. No one saw that coming at all, right? So, we don't know what's going to happen next. We do know that, okay, they tested another missile. But yes, folks, if you're joining us now, please give us a shout out. Tell us where you are. Tell us your location, name and location, right? Because I'm having a great time. I just want to know where my viewers are. I want to know. And you're not just a viewer, right? You're an active participant in this. In the past, I've broken it down between lurkers. What is it? We had lurkers who say nothing, which, fine, that's cool. We had fans and haters, right? You're all welcome. I love having you all. Michael Allen is 23 and he's in London. Cool. State Socialism is in Miami, Florida. Welcome, State Socialism. So, yeah. Crazy times we got. CL is in Atlanta. Welcome, CL. Welcome. New London, Connecticut. Charlotte is in Philadelphia. Right? Big Haywood is in northern Kentucky. Hi from Mexico. Dude Man in North Dakota. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Good times, folks. Kevin Q is in Ohio. Glad you're with us, Kevin. Dylan Small is in California. Nightman is in Iowa. Ramiro is asking my thoughts on the Iraq protest. I was actually going to talk about this. Folks, so here's what you need to understand. Shout out to Jacksonville, Florida. Dallas, Texas. Stuart Becker, shout out to you. But he's in Kansas City right now. T-Mac in Ireland. Toronto. Fort Lauderdale. Wow. Glad you all are with us. Wow. Great times. Pennsylvania, 22 and almost 23. Very cool. Very cool. Tony Garia is in Ontario, Canada. Glad you're with us. Folks, so Ramiro was asking, Switzerland, John Berkshire. Super chat. I love super chats. Was Tito a communist? I would say so. Okay, so how are we going to do this? All right, so I am going to answer the super chat because they paid good money for it. And then I'll answer Ramiro's question. So was Tito a communist? Yeah, sure. Tito was a communist. He developed an economic model which, in which the state was, there was more individual factory autonomy. And that presented itself as being more revolutionary than the Soviet model. It was more direct workers' control at the beginning, in the early years of Tito's break with the USSR. A lot of Trotskyists kind of embraced him. At the end of the day, it was actually weaker. It made it less possible for the country to be mobilized, and that Tito's alignment with the United States, his support for the United States during the Korean War, his denunciations of the Soviet Union was pretty cowardly, and I don't support it. I think his foreign policy was a disaster. I mean, maybe there was some feeling that the Soviet Union had meddled in their politics inappropriately, or had, tried to influence the Communist Party of Yugoslavia in ways they didn't approve of. But regardless, I'm not a fan of Tito's foreign policy, but he was a communist, sure. I mean, and it was a state-run socialist economy. Absolutely. The Yugoslavia was definitely a socialist country, no question about it, and that that mixed economic models, right, where they had the factory autonomy, where every factory was a little bit autonomous, right? China, where they've got the market sector, Vietnam, the socialist-oriented market economy. I mean, Bolivarian socialism, Baathism. I don't think that, these countries can have bad policies in terms of foreign policy. There can be aspects of them that is not good, but there's a difference between socialism and capitalism. And when the means of production are operating according to a state central plan and being carried out, and when production is not being carried out for profit, but rather according to state central planning, that is socialism. Now, different socialist models have different elements of the market, and that's different. But at the end of the day, I would say that Tito was a communist. So that's that. Now to Ramiro's question about Iraq. Okay. Now, Iraq is a country that is roughly 60% Shia Muslims. The other 40% tend to be Sunni. There are some Christians there. There are some other sects and religious groups. But overall, it's a majority Shia Muslim country. All right? Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq had a Ba'ath Arab socialist secular government. It was not a religious government. I mean, they did acknowledge Islam, but it was a secular government. However, right, the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's a Shia government. That's a Shia Muslim government. They came into existence in 1979. They had their revolution. And after the USA invaded Iraq and toppled the Ba'athist Arab socialist government, they began assigning everything in Iraq according to one's religion. In fact, in Iraq, after the U.S. invasion, everyone's ID, their government ID, said what their background was. Your ID said Sunni or Shia or Christian. Government jobs started being assigned on the basis of whether you were Sunni or Shia or Christian. The way Saddam Hussein was executed, they had Shia do it, right? And if you looked at the way it was not a formal, it was a pretty, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the video of Saddam Hussein's execution, but they're shouting things at him, and it almost looks like a mob. It wasn't conducted in a way that would bring peace to the country. They were trying to incite ethnic rivalry, and it seems like since the United States has been in Iraq, they've been trying to do everything they can to play Sunni against Shia, to play Kurds against Sunnis and Shias, to just divide the country on an ethnic basis, right? Now, the largest, not an ethnic basis, but a religious basis. Now, the largest religious group in Iraq are Shia Muslims. The Islamic Republic of Iran borders Iraq. The Islamic Republic of Iran very much doesn't want the chaos in Iraq to spill over into Iran. Furthermore, a whole bunch of Wahhabi groups have been set up in Iraq. Those are groups that are Sunnis that hate Shia, that believe Shia are apostates and deserve to be killed. Some of these groups, they actually believe, I kid you not, that if you kill 7 Shia, you automatically go to heaven no matter what you do after that. That's one of their beliefs. So a lot of these Wahhabi groups. A lot of these Wahhabi groups have ties to Saudi Arabia, mind you. Saudi Arabia has been, supporting those groups. They've attacked holy sites of Shia Muslims. So Iran is on the border with Iraq. And Iraq is descending into, and has been, just a mess of religious violence. So, in that context, it makes sense that any government that emerged in Iraq would want to have a relationship with Iran, would want to get support in Iran, would want to get support from Iran to stabilize the country. All right? And at first, the first government that came in said, oh, no, we're not going to have anything to do with Iran, but gradually they started to get close to Iran. They were removed from power. Another government came in Iraq and gradually started to get closer to Iran, and they were removed from power. And the governments of Iraq, since the invasion by the United States, continue to get closer to Iran out of necessity. Iran is a very, powerful country in that region. It's right on the border, and it wants a stable Iraq. Iraq's majority of the population has the same religion as the Iranians, and they, for whatever reason, they are trying to stabilize the region. So what we're seeing now is continued efforts to whip up, disagreements. Now, it needs to be pointed out that Saudi Arabia, one of the main ways they've been fighting Iran is by preaching anti-Shia hysteria, right? Saudi media, Saudi Arabia subsidizes mosques and religious institutions all over the world. And they've been pushing this idea that Shia Muslims are secretly Jews that are plotting to destroy true Islam, that Shia Muslims are they're all evil, they're all apostates. Shia Islam is a plot by the Iranian government to take over the entire world. They're pushing all of this sectarian anti-Shia stuff. Okay, this is coming out of Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, Iran is very much taking the opposite approach. They want to unify the world's Muslim community. They want Sunnis and Shias to get along. They've called for Muslim unity, and so it's very, very complicated. It's very, very complicated. But it seems to me like this anti-Shia hysteria that's being promoted by Saudi Arabia is being promoted at this point, and this is another effort to remove an Iraqi government that has gotten friendly to Iran out of necessity. And this is further ethnic violence, which is what the United States seems to want. It's what the U.S. government has been trying to have in Iraq ever since, right? It used to be, right, people talk about puppet dictators and all of that. It now seems to be that the long-term plan, once you invade a stable country, once you demolish a stable country, the plan is to have the people killing each other and have instability and chaos and constant ethnic and tribal turmoil and keep the country poor, right? And that seems to be the plan for Iraq. And this latest, round of chaos in Iraq is a continuation of that. It seems to be anti-Iran and anti-Shia fanaticism from parts of the population. And, I'm sure there is a huge amount of corruption in Iraq, and I am sure that these people that are angry, I'm sure that they can probably cite something that was done to them by some Shia government official that they feel was unjust or something. I'm not saying that these people don't have any real grievances, but is it good for the people of Iraq to go and attack the Iranian consulates and embassies? No. Is this good for the people of Iraq? No. Is this good for the world? No. I'm disappointed to see it, and I'm worried about it too. We know, the situation in Iran lately. There's been an effort to destabilize the country as well, and that, we're in some rough times, and there you go. And as always, folks, do not feed the trolls. Do not feed the trolls. Folks, I wanted to mention, right now there seems to be some disagreement between Russia and Belarus related to, their economic relationship. There seems to be some tension there. And so you'll notice that because of that, all of a sudden the U.S. media has been a little more friendly to Belarus, right? Belarus is led by Alexander Lukashenko. They call it the last Soviet republic. And Belarus, the industries remain nationalized, and it's very much maintained a socialist economic system. And right now they have a tech sector that's growing, and there seems to be some disagreement between them and Russia. And because of that, all of a sudden, I noticed Bloomberg News yesterday ran a very positive article about Belarus's economy. And they acknowledged, for the longest time, they've been referring to Belarus as the last Soviet republic, as a dictatorship. But yet, because of the fact that the United States and Russia don't like each other, and the fact that Belarus now is having some tension with Russia, which they're very economically close to Russia, so I'm hoping that this can get resolved. I'm sure this is, it's related to Russian subsidies and taxes and things like that. They're having some kind of disagreement. So based on that, Bloomberg News ran an article praising, and pointing out the successes of the socialist economy of Belarus, right? And it shows that, they will admit things every so often. It'll slip through. And you read this article, it was pretty unbelievable. What did the article point out? It pointed out that the rate of poverty in Belarus is 0.8% of the population live in poverty. 0.8%. That's very, very low. The GDP of Belarus is twice as high as almost every other ex-Soviet republic, including Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Twice as high. Furthermore, Belarus has a booming tech sector, right? And there you go. Now, Lukashenko, I'm not going to endorse everything he says or everything he does, but, he's maintained the socialist economic model of Belarus. And, at this point, there seems to be some disagreement between Belarus and Russia. I hope it can be resolved, whatever it is. I know Belarus is a big part of the Eurasian Economic Union, and it's maintained very, very good relations with Russia for a long time. It hasn't made the mistakes that like Ukraine and other countries have made and joined the NATO hysterics or the European Union. Right now, there seems to be some disagreement. I'm hoping it can be resolved. I think that'll be good for the people of Belarus. I think that'll be good for the people of Russia. If whatever disagreement this is can be resolved. But I think it's interesting that that as this disagreement is taking place, the USA seems to be courting Belarus. And because of that, they're admitting that some good things have happened under socialism in Belarus. I mean, goodness gracious. I think that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, I don't know if folks have noticed, but for the last 3 years in a row, the life expectancy here in the United States has actually gone down significantly. It's decreased. This is the third year in a row that the life expectancy of people in the United States has gone down. That needs to be pointed out. I mean, we already, compared to some countries in the world, in the United States, we don't have the highest life expectancy. But our life expectancy in the USA has actually decreased. So there you go. And it's gone down mainly because of diseases of despair, right? The increase in mortality tends to be either suicide. The suicide rate is growing. The suicide rate is very high right now. It tends to be alcohol-related illnesses, right? That's alcoholism. And it tends to be drug overdoses, right? This is the society we live in, folks. This is capitalism in the United States in 2019. We have some big societal problems. We really, really do. So, I mean, I think this needs to be acknowledged. And people are expecting that the economy pretty soon is going to start wobbling and shaking. The people are almost anticipating the cyclical crisis of capitalism, the economic downturn that's coming. Folks, I'll tell you, I am not an Andrew Yang supporter. I don't endorse any candidate. I don't, and I certainly disagree with a lot of what Andrew Yang has been recently saying about foreign policy. I don't agree that his solution of universal basic income will solve all of our economic problems. I think it may or may not be a good thing, but I think the answer is socialism. But why I think Andrew Yang is important, and I'll tell you why. I think Andrew Yang is important because he's talking about automation and how computers are replacing people, right? People are being replaced by computers, and that there are going to be millions of people without jobs. We are approaching self-driving cars. And think of all the people in the trucking business, cab drive. I mean, think about that, right? That's big. And he's talking about automation. And that is the problem that we're living under. The problem that we are having right now is that capitalism has created a situation where workers are being replaced by machines. I mean, this is what Marx wrote about. This is the period that we're in. We're in the period in which people are being eliminated from the global assembly line. The only answer to that is for the means of production to operate in a rational way and not according to profits, right? We need socialism. Marx wrote a whole book about this. But Andrew Yang seems to acknowledge that there is a problem. That's what's hanging over our heads. It's not simply an economic crisis. It's that the standard of living for the U.S. working class continues to decrease because we're no longer needed at the assembly line. The aristocracy of labor, that kind of was the linchpin of imperialism, that stable, well-paid working class in the homeland, they're getting rid of it. They don't need them anymore. They replaced them with machines. And that's the reality. I mean, outsourcing is certainly a reality, but the biggest job killer isn't outsourcing, it's machines. And there's a lot of production that goes on in the United States, especially when it comes to like military hardware. A lot of military production takes place within the United States, but they don't have people making it, they have machines making it. So I think that needs to be said. Folks, my phone that I'm using to broadcast this on is kind of acting up and acting a little bit weird. So I might be concluding this. I wasn't planning to go for too long. I was planning to just do this for a little while. But this was kind of a surprise live. I didn't give you all any warning. I'm just glad you're here, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I love, these little chats that we have, and it is Thanksgiving evening. I figured a lot of people would be free and all of that. But I guess if people have any questions, now is the time to throw them out there. I'll answer people's questions before I go. So if you got a question, I love super chats. Let me mention that. I love super chats. I got one from Neon Noir. I really appreciated it. Please, if you want to give me a super chat, let's do this. Lawrence Chu is saying about Qatar. Okay. But yeah, if you want to shoot me a super chat, what are my thoughts on self-sustaining cities? I think that's an illusion at this point. I think we have one global economy. The idea we can have a city that's just cut off from everything else. I mean, it's good to have cities with their own power sources and to not be weak and dependent. But at the same time, I think global trade and, interaction is good. And I like China's idea of interconnectedness, right? And this idea that if the whole world is trading with each other, it won't go to war. And when countries have win-win cooperation, when they're getting wealthier and other countries are getting wealthier and they're working together, I think that's a good thing. I talked about the movie The Irishman on another live. So if you want to go look a couple lives back, I talked about the movie Irishman, and without spoiling it, someone asked about that. I'm glad you asked, though. Happy to answer your question. What else is on people's minds? Anything else? What do I think about Romania? Well, it's interesting. Ceausescu was in Romania. And I think that what did Ceausescu in was in the 80s, he started to become much more hostile to the Soviet Union. And he started taking out loans from American banks. And then thanks for the super chat, Breyer, too. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then because of that, because of taking out those loans, he started having to carry out some austerity among the population and cut social benefits. In the final years of Ceausescu's leadership in Romania, the final years of socialism in Romania had a lot of economic hardships. Now, things got far worse when the socialist government was overthrown. It was pretty bad, and that kind of set the stage. It's kind of the reverse of what happened in Albania during the same time, right? Romania was getting closer to the United States, was taking out loans from American banks. That had bad economic effects that ultimately set the stage for them to be, overthrown. And it was like an assassination. It was like an execution. I mean, they just dragged the guy out. Someone's saying he was put on trial for a fake massacre. I don't know the exact details, but it was like he and his spouse were just, dragged out and shot. I mean, it was pretty ridiculous. It was a coup. It wasn't a fair process by any means, but it's kind of the opposite of what happened with Albania, right? So we know Albania was a socialist country. Albania, they drove out the Nazi invaders. There was talk of them being part of Yugoslavia at the end of the Second World War, but Enver Hoxha, their leader, met with Stalin, had many meetings with Stalin explaining that Albanians are not Slavs. They're a different people. They're Albanians. They shouldn't be part of Yugoslavia. So Albania was never part of Yugoslavia. And then when the Sino-Soviet split happened, well, first of all, let me back up. When Yugoslavia cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1948, Albania just denounced them in like the most fiery language. And Albania said, we are the most firm supporters of the Soviet Union and Stalin. We love Stalin. These disgusting Yugoslavians are traitors, and Tito is an enemy and a capitalist sellout. And they fired up against Yugoslavia. So then in 1961, when the Soviet Union and China cut ties, Albania was the only country in the world, the only country in the socialist world that doubled down and went completely with China. Cuba was sympathetic to some of China's concerns, was pretty neutral, basically. North Korea was the same way, but Albania, doubled down, and went all in with China. And, And so they did that, and they maintained trade with China. And that, there was, the Soviet Union was particularly nasty to them for doing that. Like, there was an attempt to overthrow them, and like they cut diplomatic ties with Albania, and it was particularly nasty. But then in the 70s, Albania cut ties with China. Right? And that's when it got messy, because at that point, Albania had no international allies. Right? Cuba had a lot of criticism of the Soviet Union and a lot of criticism of China. But they managed to make their criticism known, but not isolate themselves. And so, unlike Romania, that was getting close to the U.S. and getting all these loans and was falling apart, Albania kind of was isolated. And in the 80s, the last years of socialism in Albania, it was a similar kind of situation where it was just, there was so much scarcity and shortage that it was a problem. And if you read some of the literature coming out of Albania in the 80s, they make it sound like Albania was like entering the early stages of communism, and it wasn't. I mean, Albania was very, very poor. It needed to be able to do business with China. It needed to be able to do business with the Soviet Union. They needed to find a way to make their criticism known, but maintain a relationship. But when they isolated themselves, and that kind of set the stage for 1993, when they finally were able to overthrow them. And that's the thing, is that, and Iraq is a similar story. Iraq was very isolated. The Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein, their Iraq-Iran war, and what they did then, they had made a lot of enemies, and that kind of set the stage. Anti-imperialist countries need to be able to work together. And when they don't, that kind of opens the door to problems. And, I mean, I think that needs to be said. That's what you can learn from that. I mean, Enver Hoxha, though, in terms of, did he improve the life of people in Albania? Absolutely, right? For the first, he brought literacy to the country. He industrialized the country. He did some great things. So I'm not going to denounce, Enver Hoxha straight out. I think he was a communist. I think, they worked hard to raise the life expectancy, but there are problems. I think his anti-religious policies, and that's interesting. It was interesting. It was a trivia question when I used to play Trivial Pursuit back in the day. What is the only atheist country in the world? What is the only atheist country in the world? Well, a lot of people say, well, every communist country is atheist. No. The Soviet Union, China, all of them have a separation of church and state, no official state religion, but they're neutral. The government is officially neutral. Albania was the only country in the world that actually said it was an atheist country. Atheism was the state religion. And they were very anti-religious. It was a crime to own a Bible or a Quran in Albania. But what's interesting is, why was that? Well, the reason for that was because Albania is about half Muslim and half Christian. And the Muslims and Christians have been fighting each other in Albania for thousands of years. So Hoxha thought that by having the most hardcore anti-religious stand, they could keep the country together. What I also think is interesting is that in a lot of the Muslim regions of Albania, they did enforce some of the social conservatism of Islam, but they didn't do it in the name of Islam. Like, it was like women were required to dress modestly. It was actually a crime if women didn't dress modestly. They didn't do it in the name of Islam. It was just respecting a cultural tradition, and it was different in Christian areas that were historically Christian. I think that's particularly interesting. And they allowed some cultural things that came from Islam to remain, but they outlawed the actual religion, and they were very harsh with that. I think that's very, very interesting. I also know, which is very weird, is that Mother Teresa, the famous nun, some people talk about making her a saint, and she was particularly, in terms of politics, she was particularly awful. I mean, she said, quote, poverty is beautiful. She thought it was great that people were poor because it was more Christian or something. Mother Teresa was quite, not good politically, but she's admired for her acts of charity and such. And Mother Teresa, interestingly, she was Albanian. And she, went to, even though they had this strict anti-religious policy, she went to Albania a whole bunch, and she hung out with Enver Hoxha. And Enver Hoxha and Mother Teresa were very close. I think that's fascinatingly interesting. So, that's Albania is interesting. It's kind of amusing that Hoxhaism is like an internet thing now, right? A lot of young people that get into communism get into Hoxha. In fact, I've read Hoxha. I read, in fact, one of the books that I learned the most from. I remember when I was like in college, I started reading Enver Hoxha's writings. I read like Imperialism and the Revolution, and I read, what else did I read? I read, I don't even remember the other titles, but what I thought was amusing, though, was that there's a book, and it's not actually written by Enver Hoxha, but it's The History of the Party of Labor of Albania. That book I actually learned a lot from, and it's like a textbook. It's like the official history of the Party of Labor of Albania. And that's fascinating. And you read it and you learn about the Soviet Union, you learn about the Second World War, you learn about Albania. That book I learned a lot from. And it's like an official textbook history of Albania, and the party there. And the Communist Party of Albania at the time the Nazis invaded was like 30 people, right? And by the end of the war, they were in power. And that's big. They were good organizers. They knew what they were doing. And Enver Hoxha is an interesting figure, but the fact that he has this huge following is it's like quirky. Do you know what I'm saying? It's because it's kind of for the same reason that like the Marxism is now a big trend in the United States among people that are Marxist-Leninists. Marxism is the big trend, right? The Marxists were never. Albania is a tiny country that there were a couple Hoxhist parties, but it was never really a big country. Big Maoist groups, Communist Party line with the Soviet Union, and all that. But it's like now, but now since since international communism, since Marxism-Leninism isn't the prevailing trend in the world, it's like people that get interested in it don't see it as being aligned with a big country. So, why not check out Albania, right? Albania may only have 6 million people in it, but, they've got books. It's it's similar to Marxism. Marxism was never aligned with any country. The Workers' World Party trend, which is still alive, there's various groups that are descended from it still around. And the Marxite trend, it's the same thing. The Marxites were never as big. They were never as big as the Communist Party. They were never as big as the Maoist groups were. They were never as big as the Socialist Workers' Party and the Trotskyites. But because Marxism-Leninism has become so weak, a strange trend that you call Marxism has emerged, is now a big deal. And it speaks to kind of the weakness of the communist movement, I guess you could say. But it also points to the fact that we're in kind of a period where it's hard to explain, but it's like, it's funny. I'm not an evangelical, but a lot of the evangelical Christians will call themselves non-denominational. And I feel like we're in a period where communism is becoming much more non-denominational, right? During the Cold War, you were a Trotskyist, you were a Soviet communist, a Soviet-aligned communist, you were a Maoist, and it's like, I feel like we're entering a period where people can just be socialists. People can just be Marxists. People can just be communists. Right, that we can look at all of this stuff. Because personally, for example, I disagree with Enver Hoxha a lot, right? But, do I think Enver Hoxha is toxic? Do I think he's an apostate? No, I would never read a book by him. I'm a true follower. No, of course not. I think people should read Enver Hoxha. We should learn from what he did right, like industrializing his country, like defeating the Nazis. There's things about Enver Hoxha that are worth studying, right? I'm not a Hoxhist, and I think that his foreign policies, especially in his final years, were problematic. I think his domestic policies were also somewhat problematic, but there's things we can learn from him. I'm non-denominational. I'm eclectic, and you should be too, right? When you talk about, for example, I'll just say this. I don't know if folks are aware. On December 12th, I'm giving a class in New York City, and if you can make it, please come. It's going to be great. I'm giving a class called Mao and American Socialists. Mao Zedong and American Socialists, December 12th in New York City. There's a Facebook event, there's flyers. It's going to be great. And again, am I a Maoist? No. I like a lot of things that Mao did. I've learned a lot from it. But I'm teaching this class about Mao and his influence on socialism in the United States over the course of his life, which is a long time. I'm doing a lot of research for this class. There's a lot of material to cover if you want to talk about it. It's a big topic. I'm going to give a presentation, and I mean, it's going to be great. A lot of people are really excited about it, and I think I'm happy to do it. I'm not a Maoist, okay, but I think Mao did a lot of good things. There's plenty to learn from. I don't think the Cultural Revolution was particularly good. I think Deng Xiaoping, his reforms were necessary, but I think Mao was great in a lot of ways too. We should study all of it, and we should blindly follow and adhere to none of it, right? I feel like post Cold War. You know, yeah, I mean, post-Cold War, folks, we don't have to be Maoists, we don't have to be Stalinists, we don't have to be Castroists, we don't have to be Trotskyists. We can be eclectic, we can learn, and we can be scientific socialists, right? I mean, that's what we can be. So Lincolnite Yankee's asking me what Marcyism exactly is. Well, good question, actually. Lincolnite Yankee, I thank you for the suggestion. But, Sam Marcy was the leader of the Young Communist League of Brooklyn. He was in the Communist Party USA, and he was in the Communist Party USA, and he left the Communist Party USA. Now, why did he leave the Communist Party USA? Now, his official reason, I guess, was he said he felt like their approach to Nazi Germany, and he himself pointed out throughout his life that the Communist Party USA made a really big point of trying to appear, quote unquote, American, right? And that people like him, who were immigrants, who had thick accents, were discriminated against to some degree. That's how he felt. And that he hated the fact that the leader of the Communist Party was Gus Hall, and before that had been William Z. Foster and Earl Browder, and he thought that was so reactionary. And he felt like the Communist Party, the fact that they would work hard to make themselves more American, that they would move their headquarters to Chicago, showed that they were tailing reaction. And for his whole life, he made that point. That was like his grievance against the Communist Party. But regardless, so Sam Marcy, he joined the, what do you call it? He joined the Trotskyists. He never really fit in among the Trotskyists, right? He was in the New York City wing of the Socialist Workers' Party, which eventually broke away. Those are the folks that eventually broke with Trotsky to become the neo-Trotskyists. Those are the folks that became like the ISO and Shachtman. That's like Max Shachtman was in New York and all of that. They were the very middle-class wing of the Socialist Workers' Party, and he never really fit in with them. He got a law degree, started working for unions, and eventually, he and a former Broadway actor named Vincent Copeland and his spouse, Dorothy Ballon, they all moved to Buffalo, New York. And in Buffalo, New York, they started a wing of the Socialist Workers' Party, of the Trotskyist Party, where there wasn't one. There hadn't been one. Marcy got a storefront, and throughout the 40s and 50s, they were the Trotskyists of Buffalo, New York. But it was constantly being pointed out that they were not, really, they were kind of out of step with the rest of the Socialist Workers' Party. For example, when the McCarthy trials were happening, they were, trying the Communist Party USA. He brought people, they drove all the way down from Buffalo to protest against the trial. And it seemed like the approach that the Marcy group had toward the Communist Party was not that they were dirty, rotten Stalinists and agents of the Soviet Union, which was the mainstream Trotskyist approach. Their approach was, well, we're more revolutionary than them, so we're going to do kind of the same thing that they do, and win them over to us. That was kind of their approach, and they were very friendly, tried to be very friendly toward the Communist Party. The Communist Party wasn't friendly back. Then 1956 happened, and Khrushchev gave the secret speech, and most of the Trotskyists thought that was great, because that proved, see, now even the leader of the Soviet Union says Stalin's no good. Well, the Marcy group said, well, actually, this is, even though they didn't like Stalin, even though they were Trotskyists, this is groveling before the imperialists. This isn't good. 1956, the same year, the Soviet Union sent troops to Hungary to put down an insurrection led by like Cardinal Vincenti, and it was like a right-wing U.S. CIA-backed insurgency against the Marxist government. But all the Trotskyists and even like a big faction in the Communist Party USA had supported this uprising in Hungary against socialism. Well, Sam Marcy and his group said that while the Soviet Union had made mistakes, this was a reactionary uprising. Ultimately, in 1959, they formed a new party that was called the Workers' World Party. And when Workers' World Party started out, they originally had like Trotsky on the masthead of the paper. The first issue of Workers' World newspaper that ever came out, very famously like condemned Fidel Castro as a bourgeois nationalist reactionary. But they supported black nationalism. That was a big thing. The Marcyites supported black nationalism. The 60s came along, and they became enthusiastic supporters of the street protests and the militant street protests. A lot of the communist groups said that, that the street fighting and the radical protesting in the 60s was middle class, that everyone needed to get a job in the factories. They supported the street protests. In the 70s, they tried to build kind of economic fight-back organizations. In the 80s, they really started being the stage managers of the peace movement. The social, other groups were collapsing, so in the 80s, they started being the ones to have the rallies in D.C. and get the permits and all of that. And that's Marxism, and it's very eclectic. And some of Sam Marcy's lectures are on YouTube. He draws from Trotsky, but then he's very critical of Trotsky. He draws, he's very critical of Stalin, but he'll say good things about Stalin. And it was, the group, the Workers' World Party, which was the party that he built, never really had bylaws or a constitution, and it was very much kind of a cluster of young activists grouped around Sam Marcy. That's who Sam Marcy was. And Marxism, it's not, in my view, it's not really a coherent ideology as much as it's kind of, it's an attempt to build something like what the Communist Party was in the 30s, but, in the context of the Cold War, and Marxism had a lasting impact. Surprisingly, there would probably be no transgender rights movement if it weren't for Marxism. It was Leslie Feinberg in the Workers' World Party was like the first transgender activist, and she was a very, very dedicated Marxist. So, they had a big impact, and they were pro-LGBT before anybody was. They were immediately pro-LGBT, and the first transgender activist, the first person who was like an openly transgender activist, Leslie Feinberg, was associated with the Marxists. And so Marxism is, it is what it is. I'm not a Marxist. I was in the Marxist organization for many years, and I could go on about it all day. I'm not going to, but Sam Marcy made a contribution, a huge contribution to the class struggle in the United States. He was clearly a genius. A brilliant man. I never met him. He was dead before I ever came around. But is it on the par of like Marxism, Leninism, Marxism? No, I wouldn't say that. And I think that his beliefs in some ways were a little bit contradictory. The collapse of the Soviet Union, I know, was something that had a big emotional toll on him because he didn't see it coming, and it was something that he had not anticipated. There was a lot of confusion about that, and that was the final years of his life. The Soviet Union was falling, and he was like, what's going on here? So anyway, I got another super chat about Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah, that manifesto of the Labour Party that just came out is quite, that's something. And Jeremy Corbyn is anti-war, anti-imperialist. He's speaking up about Bolivia, about Venezuela. I like a lot of what Jeremy Corbyn says. I have positive feelings about Jeremy Corbyn. I don't know what's next. I personally worry that the Labour Party probably won't be coming into power in Britain anytime soon. The attack on him as anti-Semitic has just been going on and on and on, and it's very baseless. And it's like, how dare he speak up for Palestine is basically what those folks are saying. And I think that's ridiculous. That's all there is to that. Folks have any other questions? I did want to end. I had one particular thought I wanted to end with. What can I talk about here? Well, let me just say this. I'll just end with what I was going to end with. You know, folks, Thanksgiving. It is the most cliche, left thing to do to criticize Thanksgiving, right? And trust me, I mean, I grew up in a small town in Ohio. We had to do this stupid play about how Native Americans and the Pilgrims all became friends, and we know that's a lie. We know the Native Americans were slaughtered with a genocide. Thanksgiving, in a lot of ways, the myth of Thanksgiving is particularly vulgar. I mean, there's plenty to criticize there, but at the same time, I think that most Americans who celebrate Thanksgiving are not celebrating all that stuff. Maybe they were a couple generations ago, but I feel like now most Americans who celebrate Thanksgiving, they just, they want to get together with their family and sit around the table, and it's just become kind of a holiday that's not really about that anymore, right? And they say, well, look, I mean, we're celebrating that good things have happened. We're celebrating thankful. We're even, hoping that, that, I don't know. And I've noticed in a weird way, maybe this is the lamest point in the world, but it's like, if you wave a red flag or you have a hammer and sickle, people immediately go up to you and say, oh, that's, you're responsible for Stalin killing millions of people. How dare you? How dare you? And it's like, well, no, we're celebrating the good things, right? And that's the thing. I think that people can celebrate Thanksgiving and be, with their family, eat some food, and make clear that they're not supporting the genocide of Native Americans, make clear they're not supporting the bad things that have gone on. And no one says to them, for the majority of Americans, don't say, I mean, outside of left-wing circles, but the majority of people say, hey, you celebrate Thanksgiving. We know you're not an advocate of genocide of Native Americans. You're just celebrating Thanksgiving. And I feel like, this is the thing, I feel like people need to feel that way about communists. Okay? I'm not celebrating, people dying in the Second World War. I'm not celebrating, the execution of anarchists at Kronstadt. I'm celebrating the fact that a country that was very poor used socialist methods to industrialize and develop. I'm celebrating the fact that China used to be the sick man of Asia and has now become a global superpower. I'm celebrating the fact that Cuba, a very small island, has had big achievements. I can acknowledge that bad things happened, but just like Americans can celebrate Thanksgiving and not support the genocide against Native Americans and not support the bad things, I can wear a hammer and sickle, I can wave a red flag and take what's good. And they never let us do that. They never want to acknowledge that anything good ever happened in communism, right? Right? If you walk up to Americans and say, oh, are you having Thanksgiving dinner? Oh, well, you're responsible for mass murder. They say, well, no, I'm doing Thanksgiving. I'm not celebrating mass murder. But if you're a communist, it's like, oh my God, and it's like a double standard, right? We can go through the history of communism and say, well, maybe they should have done this differently. Maybe the Soviet Union shouldn't have supported Israel being created. Maybe, maybe China, should have, I don't know. You can be critical of things. You can be critical of things that happened in the history of socialism and still be a socialist. You can celebrate Thanksgiving and not celebrate the lie, the myth of Thanksgiving, or the killing of Native Americans, right? And that everything's not either or. You can take what you want from. Hey, I'm still here actually. I was like signing off, and then my phone disconnected me. So now I'm back. Wow, and now my phone is fixed too. It's not giving me the rotation sign or whatever. I'm having a great time, folks. But yeah, I was going to sign off. But But yeah, I just wanted to make that point about Thanksgiving. But since my phone fixed itself, I can keep going for a little while longer now that my phone is acting normal and is okay. So ask me something else, right? What the heck, you know? This is not, a big performance. This is me answering your questions on Thanksgiving. Keep going, says Arthur Porter. Well, I'll keep going. Why not, right? Great evening. Great evening. Good point on Thanksgiving, says Alex Giovanni. Good. I thought it was a good point. Yeah. Oh, now Arthur Porter wants me to talk about the movie Reds. You ever seen the movie Reds? Okay, here's the thing. I think that there's a movie from 1980. It won Best Director at the Oscars. It's called Reds, and directed by Warren Beatty, starring Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton. It's a great movie. Politically, it's subtly anti-communist, but it's like the only movie. It's like the only movie that deals with the history of the Communist Party USA in depth, right? It's about the founding of the Communist Party USA, and it's about the life of John Reed, who's the communist journalist. He wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. I recommend the movie. It's subtly anti-communist, I would say. But it's not full-on anti-communist. John Reed, this big communist, comes across good. The communists in the USA come across good. I don't know. And I have some strong views about the movie. And I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who was watching it. And I said, every work of art reflects the time period in which it is made more than the time period in which it takes place. And if you watch Warren Beatty's Reds, right? It's a movie about John Reed and Louise Brandt and the Communist Party. It won Best Director at the Oscars. That movie is very much about the new communist movement of the 70s. It takes place in the teens and 20s, and it's about the founding of the CPUSA. But it's saying a lot more about the United States in the 1970s and the communists and the new communist movement. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but I recommend watching it. I really do, because there's a lot of good history there. You'll see, in the 19 teens and 20s, there was a big current of people who were interested in Marxism and socialism and communism, and the Russian Revolution happened, and the Socialist Party, and Debs, and Emma Goldman, and they're all in the movie. And it's a well-made movie. I recommend it, and I'm surprised. I meet a lot of... No, it's not called Seeing Red. It's called Reds, 1981, starring Warren Beatty. And it's a great movie, and I'm surprised. I'm actually blown away. I meet so many communists who've never heard of this movie, and it's great. Now, one thing that's not included in the movie, and I think this is hilarious, if you read, there's, the first 10 years of American communism. They talk about John Reed. John Reed was a founder of the Communist Party who eventually died in the Soviet Union. He wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, which was a history of the Russian Revolution that was Lenin personally recommended. And so John Reed, right? John Reed, eventually he was in the Soviet Union, and they sent him, in parts of the southern USSR. And this is portrayed in the film. He was on a train going around the southern USSR, like the more desertous, Kazakhstan, places like that. They had him speaking at the Baku conference, which didn't happen. That's in the movie. But what is interesting is, if you read, I believe it was Theodore Draper, First 10 Years of American Communism, he goes over John Reed. And I think what's hilarious is that John Reed, he went to Harvard. He was this very kind of from a wealthy background, this wealthy American journalist who was pro-Bolshevik, and he didn't drink alcohol, because he was from that teetotaler American tradition. These Protestants, and they didn't drink and all of that. And one of the hardest things for him living in the Soviet Union was that as he was on this train traveling around, the Bolsheviks like Zinoviev and others were getting drunk and having wild drunken sex parties all the time. And that was like the Bolsheviks had this very wild drunken thing. And John Reed was a very uptight, individual who just didn't do that kind of thing. He was, and you wouldn't know that. The movie kind of completely, that's just left out of the movie because it doesn't fit their narrative. They're talking about communists like they're talking about the 60s and the 70s, and it doesn't fit. But John Reed was actually a very, very, laid back. He didn't drink and party. He was actually a very, very, I don't know what you would call it, stoic or whatever, but he was a very, calm kind of fellow. And I think that's kind of funny, and that gets obscured. The movie doesn't talk about that. I will warn you, folks, the movie is, it's not like anti-communist propaganda, but it's subtly making anti-communist points. And it makes them very subtly, but the message is kind of that Americans who believe in communism are good people and have good intentions, but I mean, that's kind of what it's getting at. But it gives you, it's about intellectuals like Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, is portrayed, and he's actually played by Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson, who's the same character in every movie. Yeah, John. Right. I mean, he plays Eugene O'Neill, the famous American playwright who wrote like The Hairy Ape and The Emperor Jones and stuff. So, that's what it is. And, Emma Goldman is in the movie, and the way Arthur Porter, I don't want to give the end away, but there's a line in the movie that they assign to Emma Goldman, which is really, it's not what Emma Goldman was very critical of the Soviet Union. She lived there, she died there, but she was critical of it, but they put a phrase into her anti-Soviet rant that it wasn't from her. It's a dog whistle for U.S. anti-communist, talking points. It's a system that just can't work, John. Well, it's like that's not what she would have said. She was critical of it as an anarchist, but that wasn't how she saw it. And there's other little subtle anti-communist points in it. I mean, it's not a pro-communist movie. It's Hollywood, but it's sympathetic. I mean, it's sympathetic. It's not like American communists are evil people. It's not like communism is an evil thing. What I think is particularly neat is that there's a lot of older folks in the movie who actually lived through it, and were founding members of the Communist Party USA, who were like talking heads, and they have them, talking about the history as it's happening. And I think that's pretty neat. It talks about the history, and it gives you kind of a sense of the 19 teens and 20s, like the Greenwich Village atmosphere, right? The Greenwich Village politics of that time, where you had Max Eastman, where you had, Greenwich Village was always, at that point especially, nowadays, it's so weird, right? So nowadays, living in Greenwich Village is like the amount of rent that you would pay. You're paying $3,000-$4,000 a month. I mean, it's ridiculous. But back in the day, starving artists used to live in Greenwich Village. Nowadays, in Greenwich Village in New York City, really, really rich kids live in Greenwich Village to pretend to be like their favorite starving artist who lived there years ago. It's particularly ridiculous how it's gotten. But that's the world we live in, I guess, folks. I mean, that's the world we live in. And that New York City used to be a place that a lot of quote-unquote starving artists live. Now it's very gentrified. People have asked. I've made videos on the Uyghur issue before. I don't want to deny that anything bad is happening in those regions, but at the same time, I think that, people need to look at these things in depth. That's kind of my approach. Wow. Hey, it's Thanksgiving, folks. I mean, this is not a formal live like I do them. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else? Well, someone asked me about Rojava, whatever it's called. I will say that I remember when Trump cut off aid to the Kurdish forces in Syria. I do remember that Meghan McCain had a meltdown on The View, and she shouted, "They were fighting for America! They were fighting for America!" And I thought, that's funny. I thought they were fighting for Murray Bookchin's anarchism and, worker control of factories or something. They were fighting for America. Wow, that's interesting. And when I'm sorry, folks, I am not ready. I mean, I think that, I'm not ready to full-on denounce the Kurds, but the fact that the neocons had a meltdown when Donald Trump and the response of American mainstream media to the U.S. government not giving them weapons made me go, I'm sorry. When I saw that, I was just like, oh, wow. Yeah, my opinion of the Kurds vastly decreased when I saw the American media attacking Trump for not giving them weapons, right? And that's, it's one of those things, but, there's exceptions to it. But for the most part, if the Kurds were some super revolutionary anti-imperialist force, I feel like when the USA started giving them weapons, there would have been like at least some mass outcry about it. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened, but there would have been some. I mean, I don't know. I mean, and then when I saw Trump being like raked over the coals for not giving them weapons anymore. And it was like, oh my God. And Meghan McCain's like, they fought for America. I'm like, huh. I mean, that made me do But ISIS is bad. They were fighting ISIS. I mean, that's admirable. And I don't know. I mean, and again, I'm not even ready to full on denounce them yet, right? I mean, I think, this is a group of people, they're a nationality, and I'm not ready to full on, denounce them. But yeah, when I saw the response to Trump's end of aid to them was so ridiculous, and the people that were so desperate for those Kurds to keep getting weapons are people that I am not particularly fond of. So, I mean, that must be said. But let's remember, weird things happen, okay, folks? Like, let's not forget that at one point Fidel Castro got support from the U.S. government early on, right? I mean, he did very briefly get support from the U.S. government. Now, they turned against him, but when he was starting to win the war against Batista, the USA started to give him some support, and that's a fact. And they were hoping that, okay, at first they were against him. They preferred Batista, but when he was winning, they said, okay, well, maybe this guy's not a communist. Maybe we can give him some support. Now, as soon as he started nationalizing things, they turned against him really rapidly. But in the first couple, months of Fidel Castro, they called him, they said he was the Thomas Jefferson of Cuba, and there was like parades. And what was funny was there were a whole bunch of Cuban exiles in the USA who went back after the Cuban Revolution. It was like a switch. It's kind of funny. It was like all the right-wing Cubans fled to Miami, and all the left-wing Cubans went back. And I think that's particularly amusing. Yeah, I mean, for a few minutes, the USA was sympathetic to Fidel Castro. They started turning against him, and then when he started nationalizing things, they really turned against him. But Cuba, it wasn't until, I believe, 1962 that they announced that they were moving toward socialism, that it was a socialist revolution. Not until 1962. It took them a long time, and that happened. Raul Castro was a member of the Communist Party, but originally the Communist Party of Cuba didn't support the Cuban Revolution. That's what you have to remember, right? They were for it in the final months. But early on, the Cuban Communist Party, which I believe was called the Popular Socialist Party or something like that, they didn't support the revolution because Batista had overthrown a fascist, a Franco supporter, and they had seats on a local level, and they had some trade union representation, and they thought Fidel's, revolutionary movement was left adventurism early on. And Raul Castro, when he joined with his brother to participate in the, the ship, originally, he was breaking discipline from the Cuban Communist Party. They didn't approve of that. So these things are complicated. And things aren't always what they seem to be, and things change. Yeah. Well, someone's asked me, do you think Fidel was always a communist? Well, he says that in his autobiography, in this book that's interviews of him. It's My Life, and it's interviews with Fidel about his life. He says he was always a communist all along. It's interesting because, it's a similar story with Che Guevara. Che Guevara had been in the Communist Party of Guatemala. Bet you didn't know that. But yeah, Che Guevara, originally from Argentina, became a communist, and he lived in Guatemala, and he was in the Communist Party of Guatemala. And the Communist Party of Guatemala joined with the government of Jacobo Arbenz, who was, trying to nationalize some stuff. Jacobo Arbenz was not a communist, and it was like a Popular Front strategy. And they were part of this alliance, this anti-imperialist kind of alliance, nationalist government of Jacobo Arbenz. The CIA overthrew Arbenz, and Che Guevara was so furious about that he ripped up his party card, and he talked awful about the Soviet Union and communism. He thought the Communist Party of Guatemala were a bunch of sellouts, went to Mexico. So at the time that Che Guevara joined with Fidel Castro, he was not a member of any communist party. He had some kind of, bitter falling out with the communist movement. So, but then they ended up making a socialist revolution. So it's complicated. It's complicated. That's what I'm saying. The Cuban Revolution did not begin as one of the holy churches of the official, it began with Fidel, who was not part of the Communist Party, coming in. And eventually, the Cuban Communist Party that currently exists was a merger of three parties. the July 26th movement, which was Fidel Castro's political party. That's what it was called. It was called the July 26th movement. The Democratic Youth, which was like a socialist activist group that existed that was not part of the Communist Party, and the Cuban Communist Party, which was called like the Popular Socialist Party. They all merged. The current ruling party of Cuba is a merger of three parties, which I think is interesting. And the rhetoric of Fidel Castro's July 26th movement was not explicitly socialist. Fidel said he believed in Jeffersonian democracy and stuff like that. But, and he vaguely talked about in Cuba, we shall make sure that everyone has enough. But it originally, the July 26th movement wasn't originally a socialist grouping. And the Communist Party originally didn't support the revolution. It's complicated. These things are complicated. Now, Fidel says he believed in communism all along, but he was not a member of the Communist Party. I mean, his brother was, but he wasn't. And Che Guevara had been a member of the Communist Party of Guatemala, and he ripped up his party card and was furious. And he wasn't a member of any Communist Party when he met with Fidel in the mountains of Mexico. So it's complicated. It's all very, very complicated. I hope that answers your question. And the Bolivarians, that was an independent movement. And I'm going to talk about in my class. Come to this class. If you're in the New York City area, come to my class on December 12th. It's going to be great. I'm going to talk about, Chinese communism and how unique it is. And that's the whole thing, is that socialism in every country has a unique character. It's based on the particular conditions of that particular country at that particular time. And that there is no magical global formula for socialism. Socialism takes on the characteristics, and that, in China they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And when we have socialism here, it's going to be socialism with American characteristics. And I don't know what those American characteristics will be. That'll be something that we determine in the course of building socialism in this country. One thing I will mention, it might be worth mentioning, is that's very important, is that if you talk about pessimism and optimism, that optimism, the belief that tomorrow is going to be better than today, right, is very important. And if you're a socialist, you're an optimist. But there is what you could call pessimistic socialism, like George Sorel, the revolutionary syndicalist or whatever. He was a pessimistic socialist. And that pessimism in the socialist movement is people who don't want to fix things up. All right? The Communist Manifesto makes it very clear that socialists, communists should always be laying out a line of march and should be constantly working to, raise the question of property, but try to make a better country, try to improve the situation in the country by raising the question of property. They should be formulating solutions to the problems that raise the question of property. Right? That's what they do, right? When people are unemployed, the socialist governments, the socialist forces say, well, why don't we have a government that guarantees everyone the right to a job, right? They're raising the question of property. They're raising the class struggle. They're putting forward proposals that will improve things by changing property relations. That's what Marxists do. But a pessimistic socialist is one who says, oh, I just want everything to fall apart and crash and burn. I just want a big catastrophe. No, I don't want to fix things. And that's not Marxism, right? That pessimistic view, that view that, oh, no, things will never get better under this system. We know, we who believe in socialism know that we need socialism to really fix the problem. But in order to get towards socialism, we are constantly raising demands and proposals about it. We advocate a peaceful, democratic road towards socialism. We know that the ruling class is very violent. We know that things don't necessarily go peacefully and democratically, but we would prefer a peaceful road to socialism. We advocate a peaceful road to socialism. But pessimistic socialists, the pessimistic socialist view, the George Sorel view, is no. We are anticipating a big crisis, a big catastrophe, everything crashing and burning, the country being destroyed by civil war, and that's not correct. I mean, George Sorel is absolutely wrong. That socialists have a responsibility to be optimistic. and to be putting forward constructive proposals. We need a constructive, optimistic socialism, not a pessimistic, destructive, chaos-loving socialism. And that needs to be said, right? But the socialists build a mass party. That socialists, that socialists put forward proposals about how to make the country better. Optimism, right? And that's what's been lost. And if you look at 1960s leftism, almost all the voices that come out of 1960s leftism have a pessimistic view. They want the whole country to fall apart and burn. They want everything to be destroyed. And it's like that they're not really trying to fix things. They're stuck in this kind of pessimistic, destructive worldview, and that's very problematic in my view. Wow, I'm getting asked all kinds of questions here. A lot of questions I don't want to get into, but we've been going for almost 100 minutes, so I am going to wrap this up. This was a rather informal live. This wasn't like me telling you what's on my mind. I had a few things. I wanted to answer your questions. So, folks, on that note, I think we'll end. Like I've said, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, I'm out.